Welcome to session two of Education, Politics, and Policy. One of the most important topics that really occupies a lot of policy discussions in our country, especially, is how to deal with poverty and inequality. And you all, as a group, are working on equity and school improvement. And so, poverty and inequality are topics that have been focused on in other classes. So, our discussion here is going to build, I think, on some of the things that have already been presented. Certainly, poverty and inequality are have been major concerns. It was the impetus to drive the beginnings of the federal government to get involved, the War on Poverty, ESEA, in 1965. It was part not only of civil rights legislation, but also of the Great Society legislation of the Johnson administration. But it really was an earth-shattering report that was issued by a Johns Hopkins University research scientist named James Coleman that really became the guiding force for the importance of addressing poverty through programs like Title I. The Coleman Report, which is now being revisited in some of the readings that you're reading for this course, or the revisiting of the Coleman Report, took the bold decision or bold statement that's quoted here. Taking all these results together, one implication stands out above all, that schools bring little influence to bear on a child's achievement that's independent of their background and social context. This is something we sort of understand and take for granted, and it's a very delicate issue because at what point does the school become enabled and use this as an excuse? But the reality and the data are very clear that it's very difficult to overcome circumstances of their zip code and their family background when it comes to student achievement. And we know what the influence of the teacher is in their achievement, and it's not as large a margin as the impact of where they live and who their parents are. But the important piece of the policy making and the politics here is, how do you construct policies that provide equality of opportunity, and how do you lead from the standpoint of making sure that you're doing everything you possibly can to overcome that, because there are examples where this type of situation can be overcome with the right leadership and the right policy. Um, this is data that I think that we've shared with you already, and this is the PISA exam. It's an international exam looking at way schools perform with concentrated poverty. Schools in the United States have much more concentrated poverty, and the United States, as we have come to understand and will continue to understand, does a lot less to support students and support from the social welfare standpoint than many other peer countries. So you can see those schools that are heavily concentrated in poverty, particularly those that are above 50% and even 75%, perform much, much more poorly in reading. And the second slide here, even more so in mathematics. And so it is very important, as you look at ways to address poverty. A lot of it is the way policy and the attitude of the policymakers, because part of the challenge that I think we've discussed is the whole notion of this universal right to equitable education, and how poverty and class are intersectional. Um, Paul Gorski, whose book here is not assigned, we've got too much reading already to assign, but he is a very effective theoretician on this notion of the war on the poor, and how equity language should shape the way we address poverty, not calling it a culture of poverty, not talking about that people make these choices, but that there are certain circumstances that are disparities that are the result of inequity, not the culture so much of the student. And so this whole notion of resilience versus deficit view, and equitable education opportunity that includes high expectations and an engaging curriculum, and how policy can do that. And so, looking at ways that policy can do that is obviously the results are very, very strong for early childhood education as an anti-poverty measure. Um, Also, Title I is one of the oldest and most important anti-poverty measures. But also, when you look at those other supports for students, it's providing healthcare, it's providing nutrition programs, and it's providing funding and support uh, to families that you deal with, that you work with. Also providing those opportunities, that equality of opportunity for post-secondary education for people. Um, and the whole idea of where jobs don't exist, providing some sort of universal basic income for all people. Summer learning is also an important piece because the summer slide is much more acute for people in poverty, as are programs to engage men. My Brother's Keeper, which was started by Obama, is a good example of a way to engage boys who are not being served well. And again, look at the policy potential implications there, and this whole notion of standardized testing, where you begin to label schools with achievement gaps. That is a very controversial political and policy uh, uh, statement. And there's a lot of differing points of view and differing opinions that are both political, but also really grounded in research and evidence about what high stakes testing does and doesn't do in holding schools accountable, but also dealing with those students that in those situations where poverty is a major factor. And so we also had some readings about the Harlem Children's Zone as a really good example of a program in Harlem and New York City, where they are looking at the whole child from the standpoint of providing all the services of support. And then I think that there again, we don't have the time to delve into the Chetty study, but the Chetty study that talks about housing policy, and it talks about how you provide housing options to have more mixed income neighborhoods that would really create more mixed income schools that would get away from that whole notion of those previous test data slides that I showed of concentrated poverty and what concentrated poverty does to school achievement. And so, you look at the opportunity gap versus the achievement gap, and the word gap, and many of the issues with test scores. The Putnam book is a really good example, but the poverty situation in this country is getting worse. And if you look at the opportunities, the three most important ways to avoid poverty that policy can guide, that's education. So education is one of those ways, delaying the onset of parenthood, and having two income households. So, marriage and family, or some kind of relationship that's a household relationship that provides two incomes, very definitely is one of the best eradication measures of poverty. And of course, the best way is just by luck of the draw, not being born into poverty. As we alluded to, the United States, you look at international comparisons, economic equity, the United States ranks very low compared to all the countries on this list. Social stress, the United States finishes dead last. Um, and support for families, the United States is not, um, again, not supporting students in need, children in need, families in need in the same way that many other countries that are developed and high achieving countries are. The United States does support schools. We do fund schools well. The question is, how effectively are the funds being utilized? And we'll get to that later in the semester when we talk about school funding.